Hey everyone, today we are completely bypassing that sanitized textbook history you might be familiar with. We're going to uncover the hidden truth behind historical children's homes across the globe. You know, we so often think of these institutions as just place of refuge, right? But the actual architectural layouts and the historical records, they tell a deeply unsettling story of how systemic abuse was deliberately engineered. We're literally going to look at the blueprints of these places to reveal how they functioned way less like havens and a lot more like forced labor camps and unregulated laboratories.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Starting as early as 1893, these were the official names printed on the front doors of institutions across America, Ireland, and England. These aren't some polite euphemisms invented later on by embarrassed historians. No, these were the actual designations these places chose for themselves from day one. They were filed in official founding charters in cities ranging from Dublin and London all the way to Philadelphia and Melbourne.
And that brings us to this central, honestly kind of mind-boggling mystery. You really have to ask yourself, industrial doing what exactly, and for whom? It's just incredible to realize that this word sat there, totally unquestioned in government inspection reports, for over a century. Nobody during all those years seemed to ask the super obvious question, why are institutions built to shelter vulnerable children branded with the terminology of manufacturing and mass production?
Well, that leads us right into our first section, the front building versus the second building.
To solve this mystery, we have to look at the architecture itself. It's like a giant puzzle. By tracking down architectural plans, inspection diagrams, and insurance surveys, a very clear, very deliberate pattern emerged. These were absolutely not single buildings housing kids. They were massive, walled compounds deliberately split into two totally distinct worlds. First up, we have what we'll call the front building. This was your classic facade of charitable care. It had the institution's name beautifully carved right above the entrance. It featured a fancy reception hall for wealthy donors and these highly presentable, pristine dining rooms that inspectors could easily snap photos of. It successfully told a really comforting, sanitized story to the public. Honestly, it looked exactly like the charity it claimed to be.
Now, what's really interesting about this is what was hidden out back. Connected by hidden passages that almost never appeared on those public-facing plans stood the second building. And this building, it had no name carved above the door. While the front building projected all that charitable care, the second building housed commercial factories completely reliant on unpaid child labor. For example, at the Good Shepherd Institution in Limerick, there were literal underground entrances meant to keep the women working in a commercial laundry entirely separated from the orphanage children right next door. Basically, the front building told a nice story, but the second building told the truth. Let's look closer at how they made their money in our next section: financial extraction and unpaid labor.
Let's transition deeper into these compounds to understand the wild economics of that second building. These institutions ran on a model of massive financial extraction, and they justified the whole thing using very specific PR language, saying things like it was for self-sufficiency or to make the children useful and virtuous. At the Artane Industrial School in Dublin, nearly 1,000 boys lived behind a walled perimeter, stitching their own shoes, operating a printing press, and growing their own food. The institution proudly called this unpaid labor self-sufficiency. Over in America, the New York Juvenile Asylum actually divided a child's day in half, dedicating the whole back half to a workshop where boys cranked out shoes for a profit. The institution's own annual reports literally describe the boys' labor as generating revenue and the girls' domestic labor training as making them, quote, useful and virtuous. The raw financial incentive behind the system was just stark. To put it into perspective, over in England, factory owners would actually pay orphanages a fee between £2 and £5 per child delivered to their mills. Think about that. While an adult male mill worker earned over 7 shillings a week and a regular kid worker under 11 got 1 shilling and 5 pence, an orphanage child was essentially treated as a bulk purchase. A silk mill would drop a £5 purchase price to the orphanage for a contract that bound a kid for up to 2 decades of deeply discounted labor. In American company records, these children were literally, explicitly documented as an investment in the future productive capacity of the mill. Unbelievable, right?
And this wasn't just a few rogue bad apples. By 1898, an astonishing 71 industrial schools operated at peak capacity in Ireland alone. 71. It was a massive, interlocking system, government grants paid per child, which strongly incentivized keeping those beds completely full. The orphanages supplied a steady stream of workers to attach commercial operations, like the Magdalene laundries, and then those laundries turned around and funded the orphanages with their revenue. It was a closed loop. Girls would often age out of the industrial school only to be transferred directly into the commercial laundry for the absolute rest of their adult lives.
But it actually takes an even darker turn. Section 3. Unregulated medical laboratories.
So the absolutely crucial point here is that having a nice, clean dining hall in the front building or passing a basic health inspection did absolutely nothing to protect these kids from becoming scientific resources. The sealed-off nature of these compounds made them the perfect hidden environment for unregulated testing. Whether we're talking about a shoe workshop in New York or a vaccine trial in Dublin, they operated on the exact same grim principle. Children without power, without advocates, and without uncompromised guardians were just converted into resources. They were stripped of their humanity to become labor for the factories, revenue for the institutions, and raw data for medical science.
And if you think this was just a brief dark chapter, look at this timeline. This was a globally engineered practice spanning over 160 years. In 1803, smallpox vaccines were tested on orphans in Australia. Jump to 1908, researchers at a Philadelphia orphanage infected dozens of kids with tuberculin, causing permanent blindness in some of them. In the 1930s, over 2,000 children in Irish religious homes were used as subjects in experimental diphtheria vaccine trials. And as recently as the 1960s, researchers at Willowbrook in New York deliberately infected mentally disabled children with hepatitis. They were treated as a perfectly controlled population that simply had no power to refuse. Historian Michael Dwyer, the guy who actually uncovered those diphtheria trials in Dublin, gave us this really chilling quote. He called what we know just the tip of a very large and submerged iceberg. Because remember, these experiments weren't kept secret by the doctors, they were frequently published in prestigious medical journals, but they were almost always conducted without a shred of evidence of parental consent. What we have on record is for sure only a tiny fraction of the abuse that actually happened. It literally forces us to wonder just how much foundational medical data from the 19th and 20th centuries was quietly harvested from behind the brick walls of those second buildings.
Which brings us to a heavy, heavy reality: the ground beneath.
We have to shift our focus from the architecture above ground to the literal dirt beneath these compounds. Because the most horrifying legacy of this entire industrial care system is buried. The part of the compound's architecture that was never, ever meant to surface. Back in 2012, a local historian named Catherine Corliss started tracing death certificates for the former St. Mary's Mother and Baby Home in Tuam, County Galway. She actually paid for the records out of her own pocket, because no government agency or religious order had ever even bothered to check. What did she find? 796 death certificates for children naming that institution as their place of death. 796 kids. And yet there were absolutely zero corresponding public burial records for a single one of them.
And this brilliantly, though tragically, illustrates the reality of what was happening there. The mortality rate at Tuam was just staggering. Nearly 1 in 4 children, 25% who entered that home, did not survive to leave it. Across Ireland's mother and baby homes generally, the infant mortality rate was 5 times the national average. So where were those 796 missing children from Tuam? Well, in 2017, a government excavation finally confirmed the truth. Human remains belonging to infants and toddlers were found discarded in a disused underground sewage structure, right there on the compound's grounds.
So how do we reckon with this today? That's our final section, hidden in plain sight.
How does a society simply forget something on this massive scale? How do industrial exploitation centers run for a solid century and then just vanish from our collective memory? Well, the crazy part is, they're actually still here. When these institutions finally closed their doors, the truth was deliberately buried. Records from the second buildings, the factory ledgers, the medical data, those were almost always the first documents tossed in the fire. Archives today remain completely fragmentary and selectively preserved. And physically, it's even more blatant. When buildings like the Limerick Laundry were converted into modern art colleges, architects literally found the old underground tunnels that once connected the children to the commercial operations. Their solution? They literally poured concrete into the tunnels and called it a renovation. This deliberate physical erasure is exactly why so many families hit a painful, brick-walled dead end when trying to trace their own ancestry.
For over a century, the word industrial was proudly carved into stone lintels and printed right there on the iron gates. The buildings told us exactly what they were from the very beginning. But as a society, we read the word industrial and we just somehow chose to hear charity. We toured those beautiful front buildings, we saw the squeaky clean dining halls, and we eagerly patted ourselves on the back, believing we had seen the whole picture. We actively chose to ignore the second building, because facing the truth of it asked questions we were simply not prepared to answer.
And the wild thing is, you have likely walked past buildings just like these. They stand in your city right now, converted into luxury apartments, fancy corporate offices, and trendy schools. Their old courtyards are now just parking lots. Their tunnels are filled solid with concrete. but their walls still carry the faint outlines of their original institutional signage. With excavations like Tuam really only just beginning to scratch the surface, I want to leave you with this thought. How many second buildings still stand right in your own neighborhood, with their original brutal functions scraped from the walls and paved over in the name of progress?